I think the thing that's tied to the metaverse, but is it tried to connect itself to it, but was perhaps the hype beforehand was obviously the blockchain, right? Which has still got many use cases, and I'm perhaps more optimistic about that than some of the other things. But same question basically. Let's just go through all of the hype. What are your views on blockchain, crypto, and everything? I mean, I know these are separate categories, and I don't want to merge them all into one. But the blockchain itself, what are your opinions? Are you using it at all? Is anybody in the audience using like blockchain tech in their companies, just by show of hands? Nobody. Okay, well then maybe we've answered the question, but what are your views on the blockchain? What do you start with yourself, Kit? We'll kind of work backwards.
Yeah. So actually, it's quite interesting. I kind of got into the crypto space, I don't know, it was probably about 12 years ago or something like this, when I was set up a sort of frontier markets investment firm, and I ended up going to one of the first Bitcoin global conventions in Amsterdam, actually, in the red light district, in some weird old theatre, and it was quite an interesting experience, right? They were like setting fire to $10 notes, down with fiat, all this kind of good stuff.
It doesn't sound like a crypto conference. It sounds like something else.
Yeah, it was crypto stroke, sex party. It was a very odd looking place. People with bowler hats. The thing is, at the time, and I think it's actually been borne out since, I think, amazingly powerful tool, great revolution, all the rest of it. The cynical side of me recognises the fact that, central governments, central banks are predicated on power and control. And I could never quite get in with the full enthusiasm, because as we've seen, you need to be able to control the money supply in whichever format that goes. I think the same thing applies to the underlying framework and blockchain. So I imagine what will eventually happen is it's run by governments as it's being directed towards now, and then you'll see like use case adoption starting to become real as opposed to fantasy.
Yeah, some kind of like CDC sort of thing will probably happen. I think there are some countries that have already, either tied their currency to it or tried to do that itself. Was it Venezuela or someone tried to do it recently? Why don't you go to yourself? What are your views on the blockchain?
It's interesting, and I think somewhat ironically that the blockchain being decentralized is actually only going to be successful if centralized authorities start to use it. And there's a lot of examples of this, and I think a few people here mentioned governments starting to use it, but not just for currency, for actual use cases where a blockchain can replace a database. Because a lot of things I look out there that I see companies using a blockchain, I'm like, well, you could just use a database for that. You're just trying to find, you're trying to find a problem to match the tech that you have. But for an example, China implemented the blockchain for their legal system, not the blockchain, but their blockchain. For the legal system in the country, that means every document submitted in a court in China has an immutable record in this blockchain that will live forever and is a source of truth. And that's really powerful, because it now means that everyone is forced to use it, and that there is that trust built over time, because it is a central authority that has, in a way, said, we validate this blockchain, this is the source of truth, this is how we're going to make decisions in our court cases. So I actually don't see the blockchain being adopted unless there is central authorities that try to adopt it. Like a use case that's a no-brainer for me is property deeds, for example. There's to see the history of every single property and land in the UK, for example, there's a great argument to have that in a central blockchain, but that needs to be adopted, I assume, by the government of England, of the UK. So I think there's too many blockchains out there. Nobody really knows which one to trust. Nobody knows which one is good for each use case, and there isn't going to be adoption in the private sector unless it comes from a more central authority. And this is probably a very divisive opinion. I'm sure a lot of people would agree on it because it almost goes against the decentralized philosophy of the blockchain. But from what I've seen, the best use cases and where it's actually been adopted the most is when it's come from a central authority.
Yeah, I don't see governments giving up money anytime soon. I don't know about you guys, but I think the use case there on property is an excellent one, because like with Ethereum and smart contracts, it's all self-executing. That is a no-brainer from that perspective. So you mentioned Doge earlier, Chris. I was looking at my blockchain crypto portfolio recently, and everything has basically lost money apart from Doge. So like thank you to Mr. Musk for that one. But bought in at the top of the hype really, and then look what happened. But cycles obviously. What's your view, Chris?
So I mined I think just over 1 million Doge in 2014, and sold it all for a few £1,000s, which I was quite pleased about. It paid for the cost of the machine that mined it, but I think it was probably worth between £500,000 and £1 million if I'd sold it at the top of the market.
Yeah.
I mean, but what's interesting about that is that, that sounds terrible, but that's just how markets work, right? And I think what's interesting about cryptocurrency specifically is that it feels like a bunch of people have just kind of have rediscovered all of the kind of standard laws of the financial system over the last decade or so, and often with terrible consequences for people. I mean, I've read posts on Reddit with some person saying, oh yeah, I heard that this thing was good, so I sold my house and then I bought Bitcoin, and now it seems to have gone down a lot. What do I do? And you just think, oh my gosh, this is one of the fundamental issues. It was the Wild West of currency, yet there were people who didn't know any better, who were really burnt very badly, and that's really bad. So it's not surprising that we're now seeing the kind of gradual process by which these new techs are regulated. And I think that's actually a good thing. I think it has to happen, because this is what happens when it doesn't happen, if that makes sense. So in terms of I guess blockchain more specifically, I think that the fundamental idea, the idea of a sort of a cryptographic proof of a shared distributed piece of information that can be trusted through kind of an alternate means of trust that is placed within a community, that is an incredibly clever invention. I mean, I read the original papers and they are so good. They're so clever, the way that it's such a clever idea. And I think we haven't quite, it's similar really, we haven't quite figured out what that means yet, and how to actually use it. I think we're closer though than we are with say transformers, with GPT and AI, because as you say, the idea of, I hadn't heard of that point about legal documents in China. That's fascinating, and a really good example of, okay, if we have this fundamental idea where you can distribute trust, and you can record things immutably for all time, and you can prove ownership, that's very powerful and valuable. We haven't quite figured out what to do with it yet. There are some obvious use cases which we talked about. There are some non-obvious ones. It's something I'm not implementing, but I'm watching for the same reasons as some of the other texts that we've talked about. Fundamental idea, really strong, not sure what's going to happen to it yet.